Okay, I think we have people popping in now. So welcome back, everybody. And if this is the first session you're attending, welcome. Thank you for picking this one and being here.
Yes, we appreciate all of your time, the energy. And yeah, ready to be in conversation with y'all. Let's see. Okay. What's been your favorite part about the day so far? Feel free to drop into the chat.
Yeah, let's see. All right, Bella, should we jump in or?
Oh yeah. Oh my goodness, I didn't realize it was already 3.
All right.
So welcome, folks. My name is Bella. I'll be introducing myself in a minute. This is part 3 of the Understanding the Criminalization of Queer BIPOC Foster Youth series. No worries if you missed the first 2 sessions. They are recorded and you will have access to them. So this session really is going to be taking a deep dive into understanding the criminalization of queer BIPOC foster youth. But before we fully jump in, I am going to pass it over to Eliana to do a little bit of housekeeping for us.
Thank you, Bella. Welcome, everyone. My name is Eliana Ramirez. I am the director of the CARE TA Center. Our housekeeping starts off with saying we are so grateful for the funding through the California Department of Healthcare Services, which is administering the Mental Health Services Act. While we are grateful for their funding, what we're about to say does not necessarily represent them or anybody else, including my employer, the Center for Applied Research Solutions. We do not anticipate any kind of challenges here with technology or otherwise, but if there is a little bit of a glitch because it's 2021, please hang tight and know that we are in the background working our way to fix it for you. So the CARE TA Center, as I mentioned, we're funded through MHSA. We provide training and technical assistance to the 58 MHSA-funded behavioral health counties and the 2 city jurisdictions in the state of California to provide evidence-based, culturally responsive, crisis continuum of care and justice diversion services. Next slide, please. We are very fortunate to work in a team of 5 collaborating agencies. As I mentioned, I'm part of CARS. We also work with Recovery International, RI, NAMI Association of Mental Illness, California chapter, C4 Innovations, the Research and Action Center at Impact Justice, and Stanford Sierra Youth and Families. And shout out, in case we've got any Stanford Sierra Youth and Families folks in here, we know that you all are working very hard around the foster care system and juvenile justice. We provide many components through the CARE TA Center. If you were to go to our website, you would find a resource library with several research articles, as well as evidence-based practices and culturally defined practices, range of topics. We also have a crisis continuum of care asset map. If you go to that asset map, you can drop in your zip code and immediately find all of the crisis care services and justice diversion services in your county. We also have a variety of virtual learning events, not just this conference, but we offer 90-minute webinars, as well as a variety of other media kinds of things like newsletters, social media. Please do visit our website, drop us a request for training and technical assistance. We'd be happy to address any needs that are within the boundaries of this project. Next slide, please. And that's it for me. Thank you so much, Bella and Ali, for being here in your presentation. Super excited to learn from you.
Eliana, thank you to your team and to Taylor, who is our tech person extraordinaire. Appreciate all of y'all's support. So this is part 3 of our series. This session is called Transcarceral Care, Criminalization and Containment in the Foster Care System. And this is really where we're going to be having a conversation about the foster care system itself. And so y'all can get to know us a little bit. My name is Bella. I know a couple of y'all have heard my introduction already. So for those who haven't, my pronouns are she, they. I'm a doctoral candidate at UCSB. I'm a researcher and I'm a writer. And really, this session is centered around my doctoral research. So in this work, I look at the criminalization of Latina foster girls through the lens of behavioral health services. So in my work, I explore the services that they're offered, the expectations of them in these programs, the mental health diagnosis they receive. And what I and many other researchers are finding is that these systems that are purported as helping systems, including the foster care system, cause significant harm in the lives of youth. My research uses a multi-method qualitative approach. This means that I put language and stories to the numbers that we already have, right? As we saw in the previous sessions, we know that youth of color, especially if they're queer, are criminalized at disproportionate rates. We know that they're targeted by policing institutions. We also know that foster youth are overrepresented in both the adult and juvenile justice systems. But behind these numbers we share and the statistics that unfortunately, right, folks need to hear in order to believe that this is an issue, there are stories, there are humans, there are kids and families who have to live with the material realities of racialized criminalization. And so my research really works to put language to those numbers, to humanize the statistics. Excited to be here with y'all.
All right, thank you, Bella. So yeah, my intro as well. I'm Ali Guajardo. My pronouns are he, him, él, licensed clinical social worker, practicing here in Santa Barbara County with Santa Barbara Neighborhood Clinics as a behavioral health specialist and consultant, specifically working with LGBT youth and adults. My role in this session, I want to position myself here again as a former foster youth and clinical mental health worker. My role in this session will be to bring clinical examples to Bella's research. I know we all come into this field because we want to help and provide hope to our most vulnerable populations. And we need to understand and know that we are, what we're going to learn today, that despite our intentions, we've inherited a system that is inherently harmful. So for the rest of this series, one of our central questions is going to be, how do we mitigate the harm we cause in an inherently harmful system? Next slide.
Group guidelines. So the space that we create here is sacred. This is a space for us to learn respectfully, and we ask that everyone do their part in maintaining that. So a couple of suggestions here, and I'm sure there are others, but for us, one of the things that y'all can do to make this a collaborative space is, if you have capacity and if your camera's working, unmute your camera, show us your faces, give us verbals. How do you let people know that you are with them? You can use the chat function, you can use the reactions. We want to invite you to ask questions. I know that it can be a little bit intimidating to ask questions in a space like this, especially because like we have to type it out and send it where everybody can see it. Please feel free to ask questions. If there's a question that you want to ask, but you don't want everybody to see that you're asking it, you can send it directly to me or to Ali, and we are happy to, pose the question, or to Eliana too, and Eliana will share the question with us at the end. And finally, pronouns. This is a major one. So before we move on, we want to ask everybody to update their name to add their pronouns. The way you do that is you can hover over the picture of yourself. At the upper right-hand corner, there's 3 dots, click that, and there is a rename option. Put your pronouns in there, please.
Yes, and as we said in our first session, right, this is one of the biggest things we want to bring here today is normalizing pronouns. This is the biggest way you can show allyship. This is the biggest way you can be in solidarity with trans and non-binary youth, taking the onus of them having to put their pronouns out. Because again, as a clinician, I can tell you, when I'm the only one in a meeting that has my pronouns, and this is coming from a guy on Facebook who said this, or Instagram, but he said, as a trans dude, the only thing I hear is trans, 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 right? So be in solidarity, put your pronouns up now, not just in this session, but please in every session, every meeting you have moving forward.
And you can do this in person too. There are one of our practices, and of course it takes practice because we're not accustomed to this, right? Hey, I'm Bella, my pronouns are she, they. Or we work with teachers who have little pins, their pronoun pins on their jackets or on their, whatever it is that they're wearing, and they have a little basket of pronoun pins that their youth can pick up and put on too. So making it a norm, right? Because when we don't make this a norm, what ends up happening is that the one trans kid who names their pronouns ends up having to out themselves, right? Because it's not a norm. They're the only ones doing it. All right, y'all, thank you. And a little bit of a content warning. So this session is gonna be a little bit heavy. This session will discuss the removal of Indigenous and Black children from their homes and communities. And these removals resulted in the disappearances and deaths of thousands of children. We know that this can be an extremely triggering, extremely difficult conversation to have. So we want to let y'all know that this is what we will be discussing today. Before I get to those slides, I'll make an announcement and give folks a minute to step away if they need to. But please do keep that in mind.
All right, and also with this content warning, it is going to be a heavy session. We're going to, like I said, we're going to have faces to the stories and statistics. And so this is going to be heavy on us. And so I just want to encourage everybody after this session, and again, every day to engage in forms of self-care and healing. Yeah.
And
We can
we
go
need to step away. I know that the conference created a healing space that is available all day. So please feel free to, you know, if you need to step out of this session and access the healing space.
There we go. All right, so in this session, our learning objectives are going to be that you will learn how to situate the foster care system within its historical trajectory. You will learn how to apply a critical lens to the foster care system, and you will learn to identify and mitigate the harm of the transcarceral care.
Thank you, Ali. So we're actually gonna, oh, also, I was just notified that participants weren't able to turn their cameras on before. Feel free to do so now if you want to. All right, so before we jump into, all right, hey Sarah, thank you. Good to see you again. We're gonna start off with an activity. So I want us to do, before we start this like full on conversation, I want us to do a word map collectively. So Ali, if you can drop the link to the word map in the chat. You will have, it'll be about a minute long. You'll have 1 minute to drop as many words as possible that come to mind when you are thinking of the foster care system. The word map will show up on the screen for us too. So go ahead and get started and I'll pull up that word map. Yes. Okay, minute starting now. Go ahead. Got 30 seconds left. Ten seconds. All right. Thank you so much, folks. And I see that people also dropped a bunch of things in the chat, which absolutely. But I do see that the biggest word that comes up here is trauma, followed by pain, social worker, removal, sadness. I want to point us to the kind of diverse set of information that is here, right? Because we have also auntie, right? We have state, right?
We're unable to see the photo. Is that?
Oh, you can't see it?
Supposed to be a norm, yeah.
Okay, that's my bad. Hold on. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Oh, what a bummer. It was so cool as it was being created too. Okay, well, this is the word map that y'all created, and there are a couple of words that are in the chat as well that I can't see right now, but trauma is the biggest one here, right? And this is one of the things that we really want to talk about today, is about the way that the historical trajectory of the foster care system created circumstances where things like trauma and harm and removal and marginalization and loss are at the center of the system that is meant to be a source of help, a source of support for our most vulnerable population. Let me take that back.
So thank you all for your participation in that. So now that we have like a basic understanding of how we generally see the foster care system, let's historicize that. I'd like to do this because positioning the foster care system within its historical trajectory really helps us understand how we got to this place here today.
You'll see the historicizing foster care slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So for us to really understand the inherent harm that this system causes, we have to understand how it was created. And this is really the case for every single system that is part of our country, right? That is part of our lives. And really the contemporary foster care system is an amalgamation of various practices that the US has historically instituted to deal with populations that are framed as burdens on the state. So this by itself could be an entire workshop, but I'm going to give us a quick overview with the understanding that this is by no means comprehensive. And in this overview, what we'll discuss is Charles Loring Brace, who is dubbed the father of the foster care system, his orphan trains. We'll discuss Indigenous boarding and residential schools, and we'll discuss the Black codes, which were laws that legalize the removal of Black children from their homes. So let's get going with Charles Loring Brace. So this man literally wrote in one of his most popular books that this system was put into place to control what he called the criminal poor, right? So he says, this quote here is from his book called The Dangerous Classes of New York and 20 Years Work Among Them. All these great masses of destitute, miserable, and criminal persons believe that for ages, the rich have had all the good things of life, while to them have been left the evil things. Capital to them is a tyrant. Let the law lift its hands from them for one season, or let the civilizing influence of American life fail to reach them. And if the opportunity offered, we should see an explosion from this class, which might leave the city in ashes and blood. He's talking about poor youth here, right? This is the man who we call the father of the foster care system. So when Ali was in his social work program, he learned about this man, right? As the kind of founder of what we know today as a contemporary foster care system. So when we look at this, what we recognize is that under the guise of philanthropy and a desire to quote unquote protect the greater good, which we could really read as protect the greater good of his class, right? So he was really invested in protecting the capital of wealthy people. And under his ideology and his cohort mates, right, like his colleagues, who all created different forms of dealing with the poor, right? So the orphan trains was one, boarding schools, boarding homes, labor homes. Their goal really was to create mechanisms of control so that the poor young populations of New York City wouldn't rise against them and threaten the capital that they had access to. So under the guise of philanthropy and a desire to protect the greater good, he, along with a bunch of other wealthy people, developed methods of dealing with what they referred to as the dangerous classes. At that time, they were referring to the poor migrants who were coming in from Italy and Ireland. And so in the book where he wrote this quote, he's discussing something called the orphan trains, which I'm sure a lot of y'all have heard about already, which were really an early method of removing poor youth from the cities and sending them to rural areas to provide cheap or free labor to landowners who were largely former plantation owners in those regions. These orphan trains, although, in the title, it makes us think that it's just kids who don't have parents, but actually a lot of the people that were that got sent out of urban areas on the orphan trains weren't actually orphans at all. They were the children of poor people. They were women who were poor and unwed with a child. They were, some poor men. This was really a method to take the urban poor and to shuttle them out into the middle of what's now the middle of the country, in order to provide cheap labor for these farm workers, right? So this is, again, coming after the abolition of slavery. So all of these plantation owners have lost, what to them in their minds are free, cheap labor, right? But are actually human beings. And so because of this quote unquote loss, right, they create these additional separate systems to funnel free labor from vulnerable communities onto their properties, into their economies. And so again, right, the ultimate goal is to remove poor people from urban areas. And one of the many forms of welfare services that Bray and his cohort developed, but again, it's not the only one, right? They also developed things like the boarding homes. They developed things like labor homes where kids would be placed in a home, and in order to earn their rent, they would have to work for the family. So there were all of these different kinds of methods, right? And at this time, we didn't call it the foster care system. We didn't start calling it the foster care system until the New Deal era, right? So this is like the 1930s, FDR is bringing in the New Deal. And it's at that time that we take all of these practices that were developed by Brace and his colleagues and kind of bubble them under the umbrella of foster care. In addition to this, and simultaneously to while this is happening, right? So as Brace and his cohort develop ways to control poor white migrant youth, Indigenous children were also being removed by the state and placed in Indigenous boarding schools in order to assimilate Indigenous communities into white settler society. One of the founders of this practice, and this is going to be a trigger warning because one of the quotes that he says is extremely messed up. This is where we're going to start talking about the removal of Indigenous and Black children. So if you need to step away, please do so. So actually, I'm going to give folks a minute to step away if he needs to. So going back to Henry Pratt, who was one of the founders of the Indigenous boarding schools, he said, right, he literally wrote this, that the removal of these children from their homes was necessary in order to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man, right? So the idea is, and we can think about this kind of logic similar to the conversation that we were having about intersex folks earlier, right? Indigenous communities threaten the fabric of what US society sees as as propriety, right, as modernity, and it threatens US settler society's access to land. So what was created were ways to control these populations that were seen as burdens on the state, or for Indigenous people to loosen their claims on land so that US settler society could go in and take those lands, right? You take somebody's children, then you take their genealogies, right? You take their lineages and their access to land. So if we look at this infographic, it says by 1926, the Indian office estimated that nearly 83% of Indian school-age children were attending boarding schools. And if we look at the bottom here at these numbers, it starts with 1900, 20,000 children, 1925, 60,000. There were in Canada alone, 150,000 children and 6,000 children who died or went missing. That's Canada by itself. In the United States, we have 360 plus boarding schools. And we have no idea the numbers of the children that were removed, and we have no idea how many died or went missing. And that's not an accident, right? We are a country that archives, but what is archived, right? And so in so many conversations, wow. Sorry?
I was just saying, wow.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that we can think about, right, when we're looking at records and stuff, like one of the questions that we have to ask is, why don't we have these records, right? And it's by design. And then if you look over here, child removal systems, this is highlighting the various ways that Indigenous children were removed from their homes, right? So Indigenous boarding schools was one way, but there's also reform schools, sanatoriums, labor schools, and camps. There's all of these ways that were devised to remove Indigenous children from their families, to ultimately break up Indigenous communities and to lessen their claim on their lands. And one of the things that I want to focus on really is adoption and foster care placements, right? Because we often don't think about the Indigenous boarding schools, the treatment of Indigenous children, the disappearance and the murder of Indigenous children as part of the legacy of the foster care system, but it absolutely is. And before I move on from this, I also want to point out, right, there's 150 residential schools in Canada, 360 plus in the US. Canada is now in a process of uncovering, right, mass graves of children. And over the past month, there have been, the first one was 215 remains that were found near an Indigenous boarding school. The following one was 100 plus. And this is just in Canada, it's only 2 schools, right? What are the numbers going to be when we look at the history of the United States and when we do the work to unpack that history? So we see then, right, that there is a genealogy, there's a long legacy of removing children who are seen as burdens on the state, or children from families who are seen as in direct kind of violation of what US modernity sees as propriety. There is a long genealogy of removing them from their homes. And so when we think about this kind of process of removal, right, and what goes into feeding the foster care system or creating the foster care system as we know it today, for Indigenous children, right, there's a very clear kind of genealogy around this. Post-boarding schools was the adoption era. So many children were removed from their homes under the guise of adoption because the premise was that they were better off in white families than they were in their Indigenous families. And there's so much kind of narrative around this, right? Oh, they were traumatized in their homes of birth. They lived in extreme poverty, right? Without this kind of recognition that this trauma is intergenerational and it stems from colonization, right? This trauma is not something that, you know, happens because there is something inherent within Indigenous communities that creates this. No, this is by design, right? And so this trauma that the state created in the lives of Indigenous people was then turned around and used as a justification to remove them through adoptions and now through the foster care system. And so this video that I want us to watch is about the adoption processes for Indigenous children.
Whoa,
Oh,
Susan.
no.
Oh, I'm looking for coupon codes.
Well, Capital One Shopping instantly searches for available coupon codes and automatically applies them.
Save me some cheddar.
Capital One Shopping.
Like Capital One should pay us for this little
What's in your wallet?
promotion.
I was adopted by a white missionary couple.
I was adopted.
Immediately placed for adoption.
I was in foster care with one family for 18 years. They were white.
My parents loved us, and I understand that, but at the same time,
They took the idea that they were saving me.
saving us from ourselves.
Being saved, and I should be grateful for the life that I've been given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
It's a way to eradicate us. And to go to a nation's children is one of the sure ways to do that.
The U.S. has a long and brutal legacy of attempting to eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations. They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resisted. A Board of Indian Commissioners report said, instead of dying out under the light and contact of civilization, the Indian population is steadily increasing. And that was an obstacle to total American expansion. So the U.S. found a new solution to absorb and assimilate them. It all started with an experiment and a man named Richard Henry Pratt.
He had in his charge some prisoners of war, and he taught these men how to speak English, how to read and write, and how to do labor. He dressed them in military uniforms and basically ran an assimilation experiment. And then he took his results to the federal government and said, they're capable of being civilized. So he was able to get this project funded.
In 1879, the government funded Pratt's project, the first ever off-reservation boarding school for Native American children.
So the model of Indigenous boarding schools that was used post-Pratt was based off of this kind of quote unquote experiment that he does on real children, right? And so, although the most recent boarding school closed, it was really very recently. The most recent one that closed within the United States, I think it was in the 1990s. I don't know exactly when, but I know that it was in the 90s. So they began to be phased out in the 1960s. The official one closed in the 1990s, and this ushered in the adoption era, where Native children were really coercively removed from their homes and adopted into white families to continue the project of civilizing them. And when the Bureau of Indian Affairs started this mass project of adoption, it was social workers who went into these homes to do this removal, to convince the parents, right? Social workers went to visit the reservations and they convinced parents to sign away their parental rights. And it was a way to assimilate these children into quote unquote civilization. So this government believed that adoption was the best option for dealing with the kind of long-lasting issue of the Indian problem, right, as they called it. And so we see, right, that there is this genealogy that connects social workers already. Oh, whoa, let's not watch that again. That connects social workers to this genealogy, right? And I do want to emphasize that I know that clinicians come into this field to do important, beautiful work, right, to help. But again, like Ali said in the beginning, right, there is an inheritance here. When you step into this work, you're inheriting a system that is inherently harmful. And so the question then becomes, how do we mitigate this until we can create a new world, until we can create a way to deal with or to support youth who need support that doesn't rely on these kind of logics of genocide, really. Until we can get to that point, how do we as adults who are working with youth mitigate the harm that we know is going to happen here? So one of the other genealogies of the foster care system is the Black codes. So Dorothy Roberts says, Black codes were intended and did lock up Black men and women and children to exploit their labor to a point of working them literally to death. So they were state-based Southern laws that were intended to control the movement of free Black individuals and to coerce them really, right, into plantation labor. So this is at a time, again, where these plantation owners are losing what they're seeing as cheap labor. And so what they did was they created ways to be able to continue controlling Black communities and using formerly enslaved people to do the labor that they had previously been doing. And so these codes are often left out of conversations regarding the inception of the foster care system. Although aside from chattel slavery, they were one of the earliest methods of legally removing Black children from their families and their communities. So through the Black codes, poor children were labeled vagrants, which was a criminal offense, and their parents were deemed unfit to care for them, right? And this is literally because they were Black and poor. And so either because they worked too much or because they didn't work at all, right? So no matter what they did, there was always a reason to remove their child. So as punishment for the crimes of vagrancy, of unemployment, or of neglect, the children are forced into apprenticeships, making their labor exploitable to plantation owners. And so these people took these children on as apprentices and often literally worked them to death, right? Hundreds of Black children were removed from their families and were never returned. And so if we look to the work of people like Dorothy Roberts, who's the person that said this quote, we see that the system of harm that began under slavery continued through Black codes, through pig laws and through Jim Crow, and evolved into the contemporary foster care system, which continues to impact, control, and be used to discipline Black families. So this is a quick little video on Black codes, because there are experts that will say this in ways that I can never.
From almost the moment that slavery ended, white Southerners were trying to figure out how essentially to re-enslave Blacks or to get African Americans as close to slavery as they could. White Southerners understood slavery as at least doing two things. It was a system of racial subordination that kept this foreign race in this country that they had brought to this country separate, that didn't contaminate them, that was not part of the political community. And they also understood slavery as a system of extracting the most labor for the least amount of money, the least cost. Slavery was a system of economic exploitation. So when slavery ends, white Southerners try to find a way to create both the system of racial subordination and the system of economic exploitation. And the first way that they do that is through the Black codes. Immediately, all the former states of the Confederacy passed these Black codes, which are laws specifically for the regulation of former slaves and other African Americans. They make it a crime to own weapons. They make it a crime not to hold a job. They make it a crime to move about the country. They make a whole series of crimes in order to assert control over African Americans.
Anything from the simple fact of attempting to find employment could be labeled vagrancy. That is, one leaving a job in pursuit of another job was illegal. Apprentice laws were passed that allowed for white Southerners to take the labor of young African Americans who were deemed neglected or orphaned by their parents, giving tremendous discretion to white Southerners in claiming the bodies of young Black people. Laws against interracial marriage were tightened up and stiffened in terms of the penalties to prohibit that age-old taboo of Black men and white women finding consensual relationships across the color line. Laws against handgun ownership. So, of course, the Second Amendment, which now African Americans, in the wake of the Reconstruction Amendments, had access to, were now taken away from them. Laws also prohibited whites from so-called enticing African Americans to new employment opportunities. So these enticement laws were designed to criminalize white plantation owners or factory owners who made deals with Black people to leave their current employment. So in a sense, the very terms of which African Americans attempting to achieve economic independence were at the center, with vagrancy laws, apprentice laws, enticement laws, and the general threat of violence to keep Black people wedded to the land.
Then, right, that these kind of diverse ways of controlling youth who were deemed deviant by their race and their class converged to create what we know today as the foster care system, right? And so ultimately what Brace, what Pratt, and what their cohort saw as, you know, the growing immigrant communities who are often poor, Indigenous youth and Black youth, they saw them as a direct threat to society and culture that catered to the wealthy. And so in recognizing this lineage of the foster care system, we see then the way that this system of so-called care has always been in place to control populations that are deemed as a threat. And so with this understanding, we begin to see how the foster care system becomes one of the many vehicles, because there are many, one of the many vehicles for criminalizing poor BIPOC communities, especially Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. So in practice then, right, what does this criminalization look like? And this is one of the things that comes up a lot, right? Because we think about criminalization very specifically as, you know, we talked about this a little bit in the previous session, right? But we think about it as this very specific practice of like incarceration, of probation, of things like this, right? But when we think about criminalization as a whole, it's actually so much broader than that. And so, for example, for racialized youth, you know, I mean, it happens in so many ways, but, you know, when we see these areas of criminalization, the examples that we shared in our previous sessions show us that it also happens in a lot of small ways, right? In a number of arenas that aren't youth prisons. And so in the examples that we've talked about before, some of the places that we saw this criminalization happening were in schools, it was in public spaces, it was in their homes, right? And we see that criminalization happens in every sector that a youth occupies. And when we apply an intersectional lens to the life of BIPOC youth, we see and we understand that racialization will compound their experiences with criminalization, because racism writes youth of color out of the project of childhood entirely, right? This is why we have situations where a Black child has a toy gun and is killed by police, right? Because that child is not seen as a child, that child is seen as a threat. And so under these racialized ideologies, children of color, Black children especially, Indigenous children are written out of the project of childhood. And so Chicana scholar Lena Palacios, this is the quote that's up on your screen. She says that the very notion of girl and girlhood is a colonial legacy that privileges white, upper/middle class, heterosexual, able bodies via Euro-Western theories of normative child development that were and continue to be violently imposed upon Indigenous and racialized girls. And Dorothy Roberts, who is a very brilliant scholar of the foster care system, she writes that the powerful Western image of childhood innocence does not seem to benefit Black children. Black children are born guilty. And so ultimately, what they're really telling us is that our understandings of childhood are based on colonial frameworks that reify racialized class and other privileges while marginalizing youth that fall outside of those boundaries. And so we see a major example of this in the rates that we shared earlier, right? Where 85% of criminalized youth were queer youth of color. And when these youth don't fit into the ideals of normative childhood, their ways of being, their survival methods, their normal teenage behaviors, right? The things that normal teenagers do, right? Their irritability, their anger, they become pathologized and they become criminalized. And so another way that we see the criminalization of youth happening is through the pathologization of their typical teenage behaviors, right? I know y'all have seen this happening in your work. It happens so often, unfortunately, you know, and I think that we talked about it a lot in the previous session, right? We had a lot of examples of folks talking about how youth who were traumatized would act out in spaces and would be disciplined for it or would be criminalized for it, right? Kicked out of their schools. And so what I mean really when I say that their typical teenage behaviors are pathologized is that often for queer BIPOC youth, behaviors that are typical of teenagers like anger or irritability are seen as deviant and as a reason to control them through quote unquote helping programs like counseling. And so in my research in Santa Barbara County, I've worked with so many clinicians, and I recently had an opportunity to conduct interviews with a handful of them who work with foster youth. And what I found in many of these conversations is that typical teenage behaviors and responses to trauma on the bodies of racialized queer youth become read as pathological or as a problem, right? As something that needs to be fixed. Things like being rude to your teachers, refusing to answer social workers' questions, spending most of their time in their bedrooms when they were with their resource families. These all became reasons to mark these kids as pathological, and these behaviors got them diagnosed with things like ODD, and in some cases, even conduct disorder, right? And so I just want to point us to this quote here. The Child Traumatic Stress Network says that foster youth's trauma-related behaviors and symptoms can result in a misdiagnosis of a mental health diagnosis by even the most experienced clinicians. And so often when this type of pathologization happens, these youth are funneled into programs that are meant to help them, right? These programs that are centered around care, but that ultimately continue their criminalization. And so my work, transcarceral care is really the framework that I'm developing in my research, right? So what it means is it's state-funded programs, treatments, and interventions that are framed as care, but that ultimately subject foster youth really to confinement, criminalization, and control outside of the physical walls of prison. So let's complicate this a little bit. Let's complicate our understanding of care. So really to understand transcarceral care, we go back to the point again, and we're always gonna go back to this point, that criminalization and control extend beyond prisons. So for queer BIPOC foster youth who navigate racialized homophobia, transphobia, and often sexism at the same time, right? None of these things happen as islands. They happen in conjunction with each other. The sites of containment and control move beyond the typical places that we'd expect, like schools or at home, and it includes a multitude of programs that are supposed to help them, right? That are meant to give them support. This includes drug and alcohol treatment, therapeutic programs, anger management, and other care services. And so this is really because while they're in these programs, they're under the watchful eyes of state agents, right? Whether we like it or not, probation officers, clinicians, social workers, we're state agents, right? With that, we operate and we report to a state entity. And so while they're kind of being surveilled by these state agents, these other service providers, they're pathologized, right? Their behaviors are pathologized. And this isn't to say, again, that y'all do this on purpose, right? It's not like clinicians are out here specifically to criminalize and pathologize youth. But again, this is what happens. These are the processes that occur when you inherit a system that is based in racialization and criminalization and control. And so, you know, yeah, so like, Ali does this work, for example, right? He's a licensed clinical social worker. And as a former foster youth, I know that he is deeply invested in uplifting youth and protecting youth. And he does this out of a deep love for foster youth, you know, but he also recognizes the ways that he's also implicated in the system. All right. Thanks for sticking with me, y'all. I know that I've been talking for a minute. I'm almost done. So when we think about the pathologization of youth, one of the ways that it comes up so often, I know y'all have experienced this, is through their diagnosis. So I want to take a minute here, right? Because ODD is such a major example of this. Y'all have worked with teenagers who have the ODD diagnosis. And trust me, I know that there are some youth that are really tough. I've worked with some youth that are, you know, just really, really difficult. But when we unpack the impacts of this diagnosis, the impacts that it's had historically and the criteria and the DSM for the diagnosis, we really begin to see that ODD is very clearly a pathway to criminalization for queer BIPOC foster youth. And so in my qualitative research with clinicians, part of it has included an understanding of their perceptions and understandings of ODD, right? And so in those interviews, what I really realized was that if a clinician had a trauma-informed lens, then they saw the ODD diagnosis as, I mean, really as BS, right? They were like, no to that diagnosis. They believed that what other people saw as oppositional, as defiant behaviors were actually just survival strategies that the youth had to develop in response to the trauma that they dealt with at home. And so the trauma that they dealt with, at home, the trauma they dealt with from racist and classist schools, and the immense trauma of being removed from their communities, right? Because being placed in the foster care system by itself is a source of trauma. But for clinicians that don't practice under a trauma-informed framework, ODD was truly the quote-unquote bad kid diagnosis, right? They understood it as, oh, this kid is going to be really tough. If they have ODD, they're going to be a lot of work. So that when they began working with this youth, they already had preconceived ideas about their behaviors. And when the youth responded with anger, with silence, or practiced these kind of outwardly destructive behaviors, instead of being seen as a kid who needs trauma-informed treatment, they're seen as defiant and in need of control. So punitive measures are placed on them that ultimately work to contain them, right? They weren't seen as a kid that needed help. They were seen as a kid that needed to be controlled. And so one of the things that I really like to do to kind of break this down, especially with clinicians, is look at the ODD criteria in the DSM, right? We'll skip C, but A, 4 symptoms displayed within a 6-month period from any of the following categories. Keep in mind that we're talking about teenagers. Angry and irritable mood, argumentative and defiant behavior, or vindictiveness. Now, I don't know if y'all have any teenagers in your life, but I can tell you that when I was a teenager, I was all of these things. Angry and irritable, literally daily. Argumentative and defiant, constantly. Vindictive, I mean, probably, right? Like these are very, very normal things for teenagers who are navigating all of the changes that they're dealing with, who don't have the kind of, you know, decision. Exactly, that's called puberty, right? Exactly. Okay, so B, it occurs with at least one individual who is not a sibling. It causes significant problems at school, home, or work. For foster youth, right, it occurs with at least one individual who is not a sibling. So maybe like a teacher, or what about a social worker? What about a probation officer, right? We expect foster youth to engage in these kind of, you know, non-defiant ways, when they're dealing with adults who have had a hand in removing them from their communities, right? This isn't to say that the social worker is at fault, but it is to say that we have to recognize that youth are not going to trust us. They're not going to want to talk to social workers. You know, very often they're not going to want to answer questions. They're going to be defiant. They're not going to give you the answers that you want. So we have to look at this from a trauma-informed lens, because when we look at it through a diagnosis like ODD, what we are doing is pathologizing behaviors that are actually very normal for the things that they've been dealing with, for the things that they've been surviving.
Yeah, I'll give you a break there for a second. But I want to point out that as a clinician working in this field, and again, coming from being in the system as a foster youth, having to go through assessments, having to be diagnosed, not just for myself, but with my siblings, really gave me some insight when I became a clinician about how am I going to conduct assessments. And so I can tell you that every time I get a referral with an assessment attached to it, and I look through that and I see removal, sexual abuse, domestic violence, community violence, I'm expecting a diagnosis to reflect the life experience this kid has had. And then I turn to the last page and what do I get? I get ODD, I get conduct, right? And it's just like, that is one of my pet peeve in this field. Just because I'm like, you are not allowing that child, that person that you've given that diagnosis to heal. And I've seen this like play out in my own life as a kid that went through services at an early age, and having some insight to the things that I was navigating were probably related to the trauma that I endured, being put into a system, watching domestic violence play out in my home. And my brothers, again, they had outward behaviors, whereas I had more of those internal behaviors, right? Cutting and attaching and relationships. That was all me, but my brothers were very outward with their behavior. They had a lot of trauma responses that led to reactivity, and they were slapped with conduct disorder. They were slapped with ODD, and we aged, right? We grow up, and you know, I'm on this journey of healing even now in this day, and I've been 10 years in like doing therapy actively. But I can tell you though, in conversations I've had with my own brothers and many youth that I work with and adults that I work with, it's like, oh, I just have ODD. That's just how I am. So when we give a label like this, it really doesn't allow the person to explore and heal from the trauma. And so one quote that I don't know who said this, but it says, trauma not transformed is trauma transferred. And so it is our job as clinicians when they're walking into our doors to help them understand their lived experiences and how that came from trauma, adverse childhood experiences, right? ACEs is not, I mean, we could find tons on ACEs, but that's what I want to say to that piece. And go ahead and read this quote. I'm going to jump in right after that.
Yeah, so this is a quote that was, it's from one of the interviews that I did with clinicians. And it says, this is a Santa Barbara County mental health worker. And she says, in a way, I feel like it's a little bit of a hopeless diagnosis. Like, oh, they have that. They're going to be hard. In schools, it's automatic. If you find out a kid has ODD, then they're automatically a bad kid. And that doesn't exist within the other diagnosis. It's like the bad kid diagnosis. And this is a clinician who very openly kind of shared this with me, right? And then immediately after talked about how she just diagnosed a kid with ODD, right? So there's this cognitive dissonance around this, right? We know kids are traumatized. We know they're navigating a world that isn't set up for them, that isn't protecting them, but still we're pathologizing them.
Yeah. And so I'm going to speak a little bit to this as a clinical in mental health, right? I supervised an agency for the last 2.5 years. And in that supervision, one of the things that I emphasized was, let's do a comprehensive assessment that assesses for trauma. Please do not come back to me with an ODD diagnosis. And what I can tell you, what I've found in that is I often hear, well, they didn't want to talk to me. Well, they didn't want to answer my question. And so I had no choice but to give a diagnosis. Now, this was in my wraparound program where in order to get my program services, you have to have a diagnosis that Medi-Cal is going to pay for. So for the sake of, I need to just give a diagnosis, I'm going to go and give ODD. No. It is our job as clinicians to do the work, do the footwork, to get creative in how we conduct these assessments. And so some of the ways that I've learned to conduct assessments, and again, I have only given one kid in my whole 9 years of doing assessments, only one kid, and that kid met with me one day, kind of shared a little bit. We had some hot Cheetos, they ran away, never came back. I was told I need to close this assessment, just give them whatever. And because they were on probation, they met that criteria. They had to have been oppositional or defiant with authority. And so that's probably where that comes from. But here are some things I want to provide y'all with some tools or some ideas of how to be more trauma informed in your approach when you're conducting assessments. So it's going to be that verbal, nonverbal, right? Kids are hardwired. We're all hardwired to look for harm. And the way we respond to things is going to be going off of our experiences, kind of like Bella's saying. So if you are the social worker, the probation officer asking these questions and they hit you with silence, that is resiliency in them. So we really have to be paying attention to the verbal, nonverbals that we come in with. Explain every single step, right? As a foster kid, when I sat in these sessions, it was just, oh, I'm going to talk to you about your life. And then at the end, there was no conclusion to what happened in that meeting other than, oh, they asked me a few questions about my life. And I can't tell you how many kids I get. And I'm like, well, so you've been in treatment? What was your diagnosis? Oh, I don't know. What's that? Well, what were your treatment goals? Oh, I don't know. I didn't even know I had any. And so again, there's like this lack of informed consent, informed information for them. So normalizing and educating them to this process, right? Today I'm gonna be meeting with you because for my program, we have to have this assessment done. Normalizing, I know it's uncomfortable. I hate that we have to do this. Unfortunately, this is the way we get paid for our program, right? And most clinicians often go out with a set of questions. Oh, I have my checklist. Do you have this? Do you have that? Check, check. That does not work. That right there is, again, triggering all those times we've sat with a social worker, all those times we've sat with a PO that just checked the box. So we got to get creative. So one way that I do assessments is always including food, right? Like bringing in some food to just kind of like, most of us connect with food. Food also is distracting in some ways. It can kind of take the pressure off. So having a meal and just kind of, how's life going? Like, tell me a little bit about yourself. How's school been going, right? And then I make these connections, right? I'm going, oh, wow, you were taken out at 13 years old from foster care. Now they're 16, right? Oh man, and I can imagine that was really hard. That must have been really, really painful. How did you manage that time? How do you think you adjusted to being taken away from your family? Oh, well, yeah, I kind of isolated, and then I'll say isolated, right? I stopped hanging out with people. I felt really sad. A lot of them that I'm working with are like, oh, well, I started smoking weed. And so right there, we make a connection that we're smoking weed because we're coping with something. So right there, let me teach you a new skill. Let me teach you a skill that's going to make your life what you want. You want to get off probation, smoking weed is not the option. But I have to be giving them that information. I have to normalize trauma, right? When a kid comes in and doesn't want to talk, I'm making this guess here to go, I imagine you're on probation because you've experienced some things, right? In the same way that every single person that moves through this world has experienced things. And so normalizing that, and research shows that when we experience these things, and the ACEs project has so much resources on this, right? That we are going to have these adverse childhood experiences that do have real consequences on our health, our physical health, our mental health. And so, this is not to say you're a bad kid, but this is a place of healing. So I have found that being creative in that approach of how you conduct that assessment, I get kids to talk about all kinds of stuff. And then I tell them at the end, right? Because this happened to you, like your body had these natural responses to feel anxious, to feel scared, to always be thinking something's going to happen. And this is a normal response. You were just removed from the home. And so having that very building connection with them, right? And in tomorrow's sessions, we are going to be diving deep into understanding trauma in the brain, because when we can understand trauma in the brain, at least for myself, it has helped me change the way that I conduct assessment. It's helped me depersonalize the silence or the reactivity, right? And now I know when I step into a crisis situation and a kid has an extreme reaction, because of what I've learned about the brain, I go, oh, that whatever you felt right there must take you back somewhere, because that reaction's way too strong. It's inappropriate for the situation. So those are just some techniques. So get rid of that questionnaire, having more conversations. You as the clinician are making these connections. Sometimes you're going to be wrong. No, I was fine when I got kicked out of my house and I left. I didn't care about them, right? So then you're like, oh, okay. And then, creating moments for psychoeducation, being creative. I had one kid, and being patient, right? I had one kid, I went into the hall and again, pressured it, hey, you got to get this assessment done, but the kid got locked up on the weekend, so I'm going to see her on Monday. I go in there and of course, I got assessed for trauma, and she tells me, you really think I'm going to tell you this when I have to go back into the cell by myself? Oh my God. I was like, you know what, kid, you are, wow. I didn't even think that I'm right here bringing up all your trauma as I send you back to your cell where you are isolated with nobody but your own thoughts, which is the scariest place we can be at times, with our own thoughts. And so with that, I went back and I told my supervisor, yeah, that assessment didn't get done. You can write me up for that, but I was not going to ask that question to that kid after telling me that. And from that moment on, I was very conscious every time I walked into probation to do an assessment. It was like, I'm going to keep it light. I can assess for trauma in my next session. I can assess for trauma when I know you have supports out here, that when I activate that trauma for you, you're going to walk out of this room knowing that there's a supportive person. Kind of went on a tangent there, went off track of my own notes. But I guess we're right.
So good. Thank you.
We are right at time, right? With about 6 minutes left. So I invite any questions about this process, because I know youth are quiet. They are what we call resistant, right? That's a hesitancy. I don't feel safe talking to you. People in my life have not been the safest. And so we got to send that message of safe by providing, consistency, being very open and transparent in this process. Here's why I'm doing this. I know it's uncomfortable. Normalize, validate, make connections. Overall, promoting this sense of healing needs to happen because you went through things. It's not your fault. As Will Smith says, it's not your fault what happened to you, but it's your responsibility to find happiness as an adult. And this is why you're linked with us. So I'll leave that there. But yes, questions, comments, concerns, thoughts.
Did anything resonate with you?
Amazing. Thank you so much. I want to say real quickly, as you guys are typing up questions and stuff, real quick, I had this really cute youth I was working with. I'd been working with her for 13 to 16, and she had been at 13 diagnosed with kleptomania because every now and then she'd steal some random stuff. But again, she was in a group home and, and multiple foster homes. So who knows what she was stealing or why she was stealing, but she'd steal. And as I started working with her, I only caught that she would steal as kind of like to get back at the foster mom or the group home she was in. She would steal something. So I was like, I don't think this is kleptomania because it's coming after she's triggered. So anyways, at 16, she gets reassessed because they're due every 3 years, right? Every 3 years. So she gets reassessed and they take out kleptomania. And I'll never forget her response when they told her, why'd you steal that? Because she stole again. And she said, well, I have kleptomania. And then the team I'm working with turns and tells her, actually, you don't. That got taken off. You actually have depression. And she was shocked. She was like, oh, I don't have kleptomania, never stole anything after that. So it was just so funny to show that like that diagnosis plays a role in like, oh, I just have ODD. I just don't listen. Or I have kleptomania, I just steal. That's what I do. So again, these labels have impacts on how they perceive themselves. But okay.
Oh no, the link isn't working.
I just want to share out, we have 3 minutes left. Oh my gosh, you two. Wow. This was so powerful. The combination between the research and the practice and really concrete recommendations about how we can do better as clinicians. Because I think most of us go into this field because we really do want to do better. We don't want to do harm. But our training programs oftentimes don't set us up to think in this kind of trauma-informed way. I'm just so grateful to both of you, to all of the clients who taught you, right?
Yes.
To your lived experiences as well. And I'm so grateful to the audience who's here. I would ask if our C-Event host would drop in the chat our evaluation form. We just really want to make sure that we're capturing your feedback on these sessions. There are 3 more sessions that are coming up tomorrow. I don't need to tell those of you who've been here with Bella and Ali already multiple times today. They are phenomenal. They are among the best among us. So this is really a precious opportunity for us to learn. So tomorrow we've got 11:15 and 12:15, trauma-informed justice diversion, the person-brain model part 1. 1:30 to 2:30, trauma-informed justice diversion, the person-brain model part 2. And 3 to 4 p.m. is building on queer BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, cultural strengths from the individual to the communities.
Yes.
I have heard parts of all of these from another conference. I cannot speak highly enough about the concrete hope evidence-based hope, right? Not just like hope because it feels good, but like evidence-based hope that most of us were not trained in. And if you happen to be a resource parent, if you happen to be an administrator of a program, even if you're not direct frontline staff, this is extremely helpful information to have.
Yes.
So without further ado, I think in the chat box, do we have that evaluation link that's been dropped in here? It should be dropped in any second now, I think, from our amazing CVent person in the background.
Yes,
Again,
thank you so much, Taylor.
Thank you, Taylor, for everything. Thank you, Bella and Ali. And it's a huge lift to present 3 times in a row in one day. So I hope that you both have ample space for regeneration this evening. I see from Taylor that, there's a little, Taylor is not psychic. Why? We wouldn't expect Taylor to be psychic. So Taylor has not been provided that link. So what we will do is we will push it out to all of you who are in CVent. So we can message everyone who's in this session. We really want to make sure that you do have an opportunity to complete the evaluation. It's important to give us feedback so we can continuously improve, but also if you're wanting to get the no cost CEs, we want to have it in here as well. So without further ado, thank you all so much. We've got a 30-minute break and then a really important, very short final conclusion for today at 4:30 to 5. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much for your engagement. Y'all have been
wonderful.
great.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate y'all. Hope to see y'all tomorrow. We'll be having some really good conversations that are really useful for literally anybody that interacts with kids, even if you're like not in a working capacity. If you are a parent, if you are an aunt, uncle, or family member to a youth, this is for everybody, really.
Real tangible tools that we can all walk away with. But everyone, have a good evening.
Thank
Engage
you.
in self-care.
Bye.
Bye.